Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to paint this EWAR 28mm scale grocery shop that I assembled a while ago. If you want to see me build this, there will be a link in the description below and in the end card of this video. A quick note before I begin. When I built these models, I used plastic cement, and it seemed to bond just fine at the time, though with some time, some of the bonds came undone. Not all of them, but enough to be annoying, so I made repairs with super glue. It probably would have been best to use super glue from the beginning. As you can see, I have already started painting this model. Unfortunately, I lost the recording of the first few steps, but that's okay, they were pretty basic anyway. I had airbrushed a coat of model color hull red to the roof. This was followed by a light overspray of model color red, just for a little bit of variation. I had also airbrushed the floors with Vallejo Model Air Mahagony, and then a light spray of model color red leather again for variation. To continue with the floors, I did a dry brushing of Vallejo Model Color Cork Brown. I did this fairly roughly, and initially the brush I had chosen was a bit too small. The result I was getting looked a bit more like scratched up floor than I was hoping for, though the effect wasn't too bad. I switched to a larger brush, which eliminated some of the scratchy look I was getting. It's still not perfect, but it's more of a general highlight, which is what I was after. I did this with both floors and the stairs as much as I could. They're not very easily accessible. I would definitely do more than this with a wood floor that was going to be constantly visible, but the fact is this floor will mostly be obscured by the rest of the building. I will add a wash or two to the floors later and potentially some more dry brushing over that, but you can't really see much through the windows anyway, so there's no sense working too hard on the interior. I'm going to leave it all pretty basic in there. Next, I turn my attention to the roof. Not going to do anything too fancy with it really. I take some model color Carmine Red and dry brush it onto the roof in an up and down motion only. The up and down motion should help convey an effect of streakiness that we can use washes and weathering to bring out later. This color is a bit thin, which is good because we want it to be a little bit subtle, but don't be too scared to go a little heavy with this color. It won't easily overpower the colors underneath it. I then apply model color Amarantha Red, if that's how you pronounce it. I dry brush it on in much the same way as the previous step, except I went much lighter in my application. This color is much lighter, so I wasn't entirely sure what to expect, but I got pretty much exactly what I was going for. Kind of light orangey streaks with a little bit of speckling that doesn't stand out too much, but is obviously there. Very nice. I then turn my attentions to the interior walls. I'm going to use some cheap artist's acrylic. This color is sand, obviously enough. I thought it might make for a nice wall color. I am going to paint the internal walls before I do too much with the floors. That way any accidental drops from the walls could easily be made to look more like a blemish in the floor when I apply washes, rather than obvious paint stains. Initially I diluted this paint because it is quite thick, but eventually I gave up that idea because I wasn't getting very good coverage at all. I had diluted it in hopes of avoiding brush strokes, but I decided that a few brush strokes is a good price to pay for applying fewer layers of this color. Of course, don't forget to do the internal walls of the bottom destroyed section of the building too. You could go all out on the destruction effects with this part, but I'm not going to. Initially, I tried to leave a space between the floor and the bottom of the walls and go over it later with a smaller brush. It ended up looking pretty rough and shitty, so I began using the same brush to paint the entire wall and cut it in along the floor as carefully as I could. Eventually, I got the sand color to an opacity I was happy with. I think I did 5 or 6 coats. Not the most fun, but it could always be worse. This entire step would have been made much easier if I had chosen to use a lighter colored primer instead of black. Perhaps next time I will do just that. Now I would like to begin painting the outside of the structure, but first we will need to do some masking. I simply apply a strip of masking tape over each window. This is just the cheap kind of masking tape I got from a local store. You could of course use masking tape that is made specifically for modeling, but that would get expensive quickly when you try to cover big areas. If you are worried about this peeling the paint underneath, just apply a little bit to an area that won't be very visible and test it there. No paint peeled up here. It's pretty easy to get all the windows covered nicely, but that's not all. We need to close the gaping hole where the roof should go too. I did this by cutting out some plain printer paper roughly the size of the roof parts and then very carefully masking up the edges. We don't want to mask the sides of the wall here, so I do my best to keep the tape on the upper edges of the wall and the roof support part. Should end up with something like this. Now a little to no paint should get inside when we spray. Of course, you won't need to do this step if you intend to brush paint the outside of the building, but I'm going to be using my airbrush. It is also a good idea to mask the floor part in a similar way. I won't be giving this as much detail, but I'm still going to paint these walls the same colors as the rest of the structure. I began by airbrushing Vallejo Model Air blue around the windows and door. You can see that this colour does not cover black very well. It would have been a better idea to first apply a coat of something light, perhaps a grey. Instead of starting over, I figured it would be a good enough base for the next colour, which is Vallejo Model Colour Prussian Blue. This colour seems to have much better coverage than the Model Air Blue. This is of course thinned for spraying through the airbrush. Model colour paints are a bit thicker than Model Air, so they do need thinning. I gave this colour a couple of coats until I had a really good solid coverage. Make sure to get all of the inner surfaces of the windows too. Next, to add a little bit of subtle highlighting, I spray Model Colour Azure. This was mixed in the same cup as the Prussian Blue, so it won't quite be pure azure, but that's not a big deal to me. I spray this quite lightly from above and slightly to the side of the model. The idea is that sunlight would hit those areas and lighten the colour a bit. No need to spend too much time on this, just a quick light spray. Now we can remove some of the masking tape if you like. I figure it's best to remove what you can as soon as possible to reduce the chance of it bonding to the paint too much. You can see there was a little bit of bleed through with the blue on this window, but it's not really worth worrying about. Obviously we can't take off the mask for the front window or upstairs windows, but that's okay. Now, unless you would prefer to paint right over the nice blue that's just been applied, more masking will need to be done. I carefully apply masking tape to the doors and windows. I use the handle of a knife to help press the tape into corners. You can do this the careful way or the less than careful way. It is a bit tedious and you are probably going to have to do some cleanup either way. It's just a matter of doing more or less cleanup. I got tired of trying to carefully get the masking tape on straight at each corner of every window, so the masks on the rear of the structure are pretty rough. That's fine though, it can be dealt with later. Now the exterior can be painted. I used Vallejo Model Colour London Grey. I think I'd thinned it down a little bit too much, but that's okay. I think the slightly patchy and inconsistent look I got after a few coats of this will add to the overall effect rather than detract from it. This step is fairly straightforward. It's more or less just painting a flat surface. Just be sure to spray the sides of the wall at the top of the inside of the building. They will be visible above the roof. While we're at it, the bottom floor destroyed walls will receive the same colour. Next, I sprayed a layer of Vallejo Model Colour Stone Grey. I figured this colour would make the building look more painted than just plain concrete. I'm not sure what this building is meant to be made from, but I don't think it's concrete. The Stone Grey gives it a slightly warmer and maybe a little more dirty colour. This is only sprayed on lightly so as not to completely obliterate the grey underneath it. The random slight patchiness and inconsistent coloration should make it look a bit more natural and real, or at least that's my intention. Of course, don't forget the lower destroyed wall section. Now we can remove the masking tape and take a look at what's underneath. Like a Christmas present we've bought for ourselves. We already know what's inside. You can see the masking I did on the back of the building is really quite sloppy. Some might even say appalling. It does look much better on the front. Only one tiny bit of blue was lifted by the tape, easily fixed with the same colours that it was painted with. Now to fix up the messy edges around the windows. I did this by carefully applying thinned down Model Colour London Grey around the edges. This takes a bit of time, but it isn't too hard. As I was doing this, it occurred to me that it would have been much more sensible to apply the greys and then mask off around the windows and spray the blues. It probably would have been less tedious to do that masking. Oh well, too late for me, but I would suggest anyone emulating this to do that instead of what I did. The result does look a bit like around the window has been repaired or something. It is a bit dark, so I'm going to try and blend it in with the surrounding wall a little bit. Same thing for the door, though this time we don't have much of an edge to guide our paintbrush, so I had to paint these lines as neatly as I could. For some reason, I've always found it a little bit easier to paint straight lines vertically rather than horizontally, so don't be afraid to turn the model whichever way makes it easier and more comfortable for you to paint. I think the door appears to have a lot more depth now. I then applied a wash to the internal corners of the walls and floors. The wash was 2 parts dark tone to 1 part water. I applied this fairly roughly, making sure to also get it on the patches of sand I accidentally got on the floor earlier. The rough application made this look really messy and dirty, and I wasn't entirely satisfied with it. I had hoped additional washes later would improve the appearance, but it doesn't matter too much being on the inside. It won't be visible too often. I also gave the ruined bottom floor part the same treatment, also adding the same wash to the outside corners. Next, I figured I might try a wash of Secret Weapon parchment wash on the interior walls. It was diluted about 50-50 with water. I also applied it to the destroyed section. It didn't really do much, though it did brighten the sand colour a tiny bit and helped tone down the darkness in the corners. Probably not really worth the effort, but it's done now. Then, I quickly hit the floors with a wash of Army Painter Strong Tone, mixed 2 parts Strong Tone and 1 part water. I just sloshed it all over the floors quite heavily. I got a little bit on the walls in some places, but that doesn't really matter. It's just going to look like dirt and scuff marks anyway. By now we should be used to remembering that this should also be done on the lower floor part too. Next, I turned my attention towards the roof. I applied a wash of Soft Tone diluted roughly 2 parts Soft Tone to 1 part water. I just roughly apply it all over the roof. I want the wash to settle into the gaps between the tiles, so I leave the parts lying flat to dry. Continuing with the Army Painter Soft Tone, I changed the dilution to 1 part Soft Tone and 1 part water, and then apply it to the internal walls. I figured if the walls already look kind of dirty, then let's just make them look more consistently dirty. Roughly apply this mix on all of the interior walls. Doesn't matter if you get it on the floor or anything like that. If the walls are dirty, then so are the floors. I sure hope you aren't sick of washes yet, because next I applied a wash of Army Painter Dark Tone to the outside of the model. This was diluted roughly 1 part dark tone to 2 parts water. I just slosh it onto the walls and brush it downwards. The idea here is to represent grime and gunk that gets washed down the walls in the rain. It doesn't need to be too heavy and dark, just some nice subtle variations in colour. I did do this effect twice because I wasn't quite satisfied with the first application, and I figured doing it twice would make it look a little bit more realistic. Next, I do a quick highlight on the corners of the wall with a dry brushing of some model colour stone grey, just to bring out the edges a little bit. Be sure to do this all the way up the wall and along the very top part too. I think it's really starting to look more depressing and appropriate for a war zone, though there is still a little bit more weathering to come. I think this is a good example of what you can do with a couple of colours and a simple wash. Next, I figured I might add a little bit of interest to the door. I applied Vallejo Model Air gunmetal to what I just kind of assumed is the door handle. If it's not, then I guess it's a shiny sign or something. It's just something to break up the door a little bit and it might catch the eye. I highlight the handle with Model Air steel along the very top edge of the part, and that was about it for the acrylics and washes. I gave all the parts of the model a coating of Vallejo satin varnish to protect it from the next steps, which involve enamel weathering effects. Once I'd left the varnish to dry for a while, I decided it was finally time to install the windows. They are going to look well and truly out of place as they currently are. They're way too clean. We need to dirty them up a little bit. I lied when I said we were done with the acrylics. These windows have one side that is intended to face outward. It's hard to demonstrate because they're white, but the outside of the window frame is a matte colour and it doesn't reflect the light. The reverse side reflects the light on the clear and white parts. I apply a light wash of Army Painter Strong Tone mixed roughly 1 part Strong Tone to 3 parts water. Just brush it onto all the white parts. It's not too big a deal if you get it on the clear parts too. All we really need here is a slight dirtying of the white colour so it doesn't quite stand out so much. Once the windows are sufficiently dirty, it's time to glue them into place. I applied some super glue to the bottom of the window frame and then carefully manoeuvred the part into place. This was a little bit fiddly to get right, especially when trying to avoid getting the super glue on the clear part of the window, and trying to avoid gluing the part to my fingers, but I got there eventually. I secure the upper part of the windows into place with a couple of small drops of super glue. I think it looks pretty good from the outside. The windows look sufficiently dirty and not so out of place. You could try adding cracks and making them look smashed with a knife, though it would be very easy to accidentally add cracks to the window frame too. You could also omit the parts completely and the building would still look fine. I like them in though. Unfortunately, they do make the inside of the building look a little bit worse, at least in my opinion. I hadn't thought of it before putting these in, but the white back part of the window just looks kind of bad. At this stage, I had decided that I wasn't going to worry about the inside much at all, but this might be worth considering if you want a more detailed interior. I'm sure you could paint over the white on the backs of the windows or something to try and blend them into the wall colour a little little bit better. Time for enamels. I applied AK Interactive panel liner to the roof. I tried to apply it only between the gaps in the tiles, but it didn't quite have the capillary action I was hoping for. I think that's because the gaps aren't very deep. That's okay. I used the brush to get it into all the gaps. It was a bit time consuming. Eventually, I got a little bit lazy and messy, and most of the tiles were coated in the panel liner as well as the gaps. I left that to dry for a little while, and I thought it looked a little bit too dark. So I applied thinner to the roof and rubbed away the panel liner on the surface of the tiles so the colours underneath would be more visible. I think I got a pretty decent result. I then sealed that with a layer of satin varnish. Then, before proceeding with further steps, I glue on one half of the roof. I do this pretty carefully, and of course I use super glue. The top of the roof should line up with the roof supporty part like so. I then add a little glue in the centre here to hold everything nicely. The other half of the roof doesn't need to be glued on. It's shaped such that it can simply be put into place and it shouldn't just fall off the building. Obviously having this removable makes it possible to place infantry figures into the building. The very peak of the roof does look a little bit dodgy. There is a bit of a gap, but I guess that is the price we pay for easily removed roofs without the need for any tricksy magnets or anything like that. Let's get back to weathering this thing. I take some AK Interactive dark streaking grime, though I'm not entirely sure it's intended for this specific purpose. I streak it down from the top of the roof, applying it in different amounts in different areas to give it a more natural look. I also used it on the walls to create streaks coming down from the roof, collecting under the windows, and then streaking down from there. I also added tiny amounts of it to the windowsills. It was my hope that the streaks coming from under the windows would give them some depth, and that's probably a sensible place for the dirt to accumulate and then be washed down by the rain. I applied the dark streaking grime pretty heavily where the roof meets the walls. I didn't bother applying this to the destroyed lower floor section. The grime streaks don't look very natural as applied, so to blend them into the model I take a brush with clean thinner on it and use it to thin out the streaks, running the brush in a downward direction only, the same as the rain would do. The idea here is to thin out the streaks a little bit so that they blend in and look a bit less conspicuous. If you thin them out too much, you can just apply the dark streaking grime again and repeat the process. You can do it as many times as you like really. The satin varnish layer should protect the acrylic paint beneath from being damaged. I did the same thing with the streaks on the walls. I'm not entirely sure I did this very well, but I think it has turned out okay. I'm still pretty new to using these enamels. The surface of the model is slightly bumpy, so more of the wash stayed in those tiny recesses than on top of the surface. It looked odd, but not particularly bad. A project this size is probably not the best use of expensive paints like these enamels. Next time I might try making my own oil washes with artists' oils again. Maybe not, we'll have to see. I didn't really use a whole lot here anyway. Now it is time for dust. I have achieved pretty good results on tanks spraying very diluted mixtures of AK Interactive dirt colours, so I figured it would work just as well for a building. I started by spraying Summer Cursed Earth. I'm not sure exactly how much it was diluted, but it was quite a lot. It has to be really thin or it doesn't quite look like dust. We want dust, not mud. It's not like a grocery store is going to be slogging through the mud, is it? I spray it all over the model, though it is mostly focused around the base of the building. I figure that's the most likely place for the majority of the dust to accumulate. I wasn't entirely satisfied with the colour I was getting with the Summer Cursed Earth, so I also sprayed some AK Interactive Dark Mud. This was more concentrated towards the bottom of the building, though I did spray a tiny bit higher up on the walls. I like the way this sort of darkened it down a bit. I apply these colours very lightly and slowly, gradually building them up in areas I want the colours to be a little bit darker. I think it's a pretty convincing effect. It looks like a building that hasn't really been touched for a very long time. I wasn't entirely sure if I wanted to remove the dust from the windows. I kind of like it. It does make it next to impossible to see inside the building though. But I guess that's not really a problem. I used a Q-tip to rub away the dust effect from a couple of windows. It looks as though somebody has wiped away the dust to look inside. Adds a bit of character. I feel a bit silly about it, but you can see that I didn't realise how different the floor part would look compared to the weathered building. I should have weathered that too, but I'm too lazy, so that's how it stays. I applied some Tester's dull coat to dull everything down a little bit, though I figured that wouldn't be very entertaining viewing. And that's the model complete. As you can see, it makes a good place for 28mm scale infantry, like my British commandos for bolt action. They're probably the ones who made the walls so filthy. I'm pretty happy with how this paint job has turned out. It's not overly complicated, but then it doesn't really need to be, does it? It's just a simple building in a war zone. It doesn't demand too much attention or anything like that. Something I really wanted to add to this model was some propaganda posters. I had wanted to use a couple that came on the instruction sheets for some foreground structures I built a while ago. I think something like that would really add a lot of character and interest. Unfortunately, I couldn't find them, so I did without, but it's something I really wanted to add. I still could if I came across some, but it's really something that would look better if it was applied prior to the dust layers. Despite that though, I think it looks pretty good, and it will make my admittedly rare games of bolt action look that little bit nicer to look at. Last time we played, this building and the EWAR warehouse were plain white, not even primed. Next time we'll have some colour and it's going to be great. I do plan to paint that warehouse pretty soon. I may use it to experiment a bit more with making my own oil washes and probably use more of the cheap artist's acrylics rather than the expensive model paints. Sure, it's fine to do 1 or 2 buildings with model paints, but you will run out of them very quickly if you plan to do more than a couple of structures. Of course, it is, as always, your own choice. If you want to see my build video for this model, a link is in the description and you can also click the end card at the end of this video. I think most of the techniques I've used in this project are fairly simple and you either already know them yourself or could pick them up pretty easily. But if there's anything you would like me to go over in more depth, leave a comment in the comment section to let me know, and I'll see about making a little video about it. I do hope to be able to help people learn and enjoy the hobby as much as I do. I'm also definitely open to suggestions as to how I might improve myself too. For those that are interested, I will post a list of all the paints I've used in this video in the description. Of course, they're not law, and you can use whatever colours you like to paint your own buildings, but it is nice to have suggestions. I hope this video has been helpful or interesting. I do plan to make more painting videos pretty soon, so stick around if that's what you're into. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, or if you just want to say buts, then feel free to do so in the comments section below. If you like my videos, I would appreciate it if you shared them with other people you think may find them helpful or interesting. Also, it would be great if you subscribe to this channel as well as my original channel, a link to which is in the description. And if you really like what I do, then consider supporting me on Patreon. A link is in the description and you should be able to click the end card as well. It would be truly appreciated. If you don't like what I do, then I have no idea what you're doing here. Thanks for watching. Farewell.